Yeah, in this tutorial we are going to learn about basics of Kubernetes. So Kubernetes is an open source container orchestration platform where it is going to manage with a number of containers deployed by a Docker containerized tool. And Kubernetes is portable and as well as extensible, and it is an open source platform. And it provides like a single node cluster environment so that we can also practice with the on-premise and with the local systems. And in production, Kubernetes is used on cloud services. So Kubernetes is a tool where we can manage with containers, and also we can orchestrate the containers, its workloads, and its scalability features. And it can also support with both declarative configuration and as well as automation. And it has very good support with a very large ecosystem. And Kubernetes uh, to start practice with, like first of all we must understand the basic architecture of Kubernetes tool, how internally it is going to manage with the number of containers, and what is a cluster, and what is the CLI tool is used to connect with this Kubernetes tool. So first here majorly we are going to practice with two tools, like one is Minikube, which is going to be a single node cluster we are going to deploy in our system, and then the second is Kubectl, so that to connect with the Minikube cluster and to practice with Kubernetes. Before we start with this Minikube and the Kubectl installations, first let us understand with what is Kubernetes internal architecture. So Kubernetes is always, it is internally maintaining client server architecture, and it provides mainly with a master and the worker nodes. So master node is going to manage with the entire cluster. It is going to perform with the API calls and as well as configurations and scheduling of the various nodes under the cluster. So next is the nodes what we have, which is the node in which, like, we are going to deploy with multiple containers and we are going to run with. So in master component mainly we have etcd, where we have the configuration about each and every node in the cluster. And the next is, like, we have an API server, which is, this component is going to provide the basic operations with external API calls. And coming to the controller manager, it is going to control the entire cluster nodes, and also it controls the endpoint. It has the various controller components, like it has a replication controller where it can manage with the number of replica sets for the given node, and it has a controller called as endpoint controller, and it has a namespace where common cluster nodes can be shared by one or more users. So, and also service account controller. This is all the part of control manager. And there is a scheduler component where this component is going to manage with the available nodes and to balance the workload across the number of nodes in the cluster. So this is all the major components in our master node, like etcd, API server, controller manager, and scheduler. And coming to in Kubernetes, we have the node in which we have kubelet service, where using like kubelet, we have like command line interface to communicate with the cluster and to perform with the deployment of the containers, and all the features of the pods what we are going to create can be managed with this service. And any one of the virtual machine we need to work with the number of nodes to be configured in the cluster. So for which, like, we have the various tools we can use, like Hyper-V and Docker containerization tool, right? Like we will be practicing with Hyper-V on Windows. And coming to, we have a proxy service, Kubernetes proxy service, which is used to have connection with each node in the cluster with the external host. And this is going to manage with the node and its volumes, like for each node, like what kind of storage we are going to use, and what all the secrets means, like for authentication purpose, any security features we are going to use with. To manage all these features, we are going to use with this Kubernetes proxy service. And this is about the basic master and node structures, and in which, like in the Kubernetes applications, like whenever we create a smallest basic unit which is a runnable instance on the cluster, which we call it as a pod. It's an application, running application, you can say. And then is called node is a host where we are going to maintain the number of pods. It's a physical machine or a virtual machine you are going to use to maintain your Kubernetes cluster. There can be multiple nodes, and here each node is also called as a minion. And for set of pods, like related pods can be formed as a service in Kubernetes, and we can also form number of services to manage and to perform some additional services for load balancing and all. For the pods we will be using with service. Means for every application you are going to create and deploy on your Kubernetes cluster, so it is going to maintain all these objects like pod and then services, namespaces, and replica set. We are going to see practically. Replica set is nothing but it's a number of pods what you wanted to use at runtime for your application. Let's say you wanted to scale up your pod for a number of replica sets. Yes, you can configure that. And namespace is where like logically number of users can share this namespace to deploy the nodes. So this is the basic terminology in Kubernetes, and the features, if you can see, like Kubernetes is mainly provided with scalability. So you can have the horizontal scaling here. So whenever you want, immediately you can configure your pod to scale up for a number of instances by editing and configuring file, and then you can scale up. At the same time, based on your demand, you can up, and as well as you can scale down as well. And automatic bin packing is another feature in Kubernetes, and we have service discovery and load balancing for number of pods running with, and automated rollouts and rollbacks can be done for your application configurations. We have a persistent storage of your cluster information, and also self-healing is possible. This is all about like features of your Kubernetes. And then here in the architecture, as we discussed on the top, like this is a master node where we have API server, ETDC for configuration, scheduler, and controller manager. This will have multiple controllers here, and API server is going to interact with your API calls with the end user. Scheduler is going to manage with the number of nodes in the cluster and its interactions with the master node. And ETDC is having the whole configuration for all the services running with. And coming to the nodes what we are working with, each node can be a physical and virtual node in which we are going to deploy the pods. Pod is a running application. There may be multiple nodes, and for each pod which is running in the cluster, like we have the other objects called as replica set, namespace, okay, and services for each pod. So like collection of related pods can be made it as one service. So this is all the components of the master node. In the slave node, like as we discussed on the top, same thing is explained here, like a kubelet, kube proxy. And coming to pod is nothing but, once again, it is nothing but a one or more containers which are executing on your cluster. So this is about the basics part. So to start running with Kubernetes into our system, first of all we need the two components. So the two components we need in our application is one is local Kubernetes cluster we need to configure, because we are not going to work with cloud services where in production we are going to use with Kubernetes cluster on the cloud. We would like to practice in this session only the local installation. So with the single node Kubernetes cluster we are going to create, which is called as Minikube. Minikube is a tool where we are going to make the practice of Kubernetes locally, so that you can create you can start the cluster, and then you can observe the cluster UI interface, and you can see the status, and then we can also create with a number of applications. So for which we need a cluster installation first. So that is a tool we are going to do called Minikube, and it is going to run, and it provides for all the platforms. We have a Minikube installers for Linux, okay, Windows, Mac, all the platforms. So you need to download according to your configuration, and you can start your cluster in your laptop, and then you can start practice with. That is about Minikube. And one more tool we are going to do is called Kubectl. It is a command line interface where we are going to practice with our cluster to deploy your containers and check the status of your containers on your cluster Minikube. So let's first check Minikube and Kubectl installations. So to download your Minikube installer, you just go to the Minikube installer page. So this is installation. Just you go to this page, and where you can choose your type of the installer and go for and download. So once it is downloaded in my system, this is an installer which is downloaded, you just need to set the path for Minikube. Once it is done, like in your system, like you need to start with a PowerShell window, and you just need to run it as administrator. So let me close the previous windows, and then let me start with a new PowerShell window, and in which you always need to run with the administrator. And here first of all, if you have done with an installation and your path setting is done, now you can check here Minikube version. So here you can see, and then you can check with the Minikube start. So now it is going to start with your cluster. So it takes a few parameters where it has to start with our single node cluster in our local machine, so that it is going to check all your system available features based on the resources given, it is going to enable your cluster. And here we have a few steps, if at all, if you are facing any issues in installing your Minikube. So if at all, if you have any error in starting Minikube, just you need to enable with any one of the virtual host. Here you can see, after you download your tool, you need to start with a cluster. Whenever you are starting with a cluster, if you have any challenges here, you just need to enable your here itself you can see a drivers page. So if at all any issues in starting your Minikube, just you need, first time when you are doing, you need to start with the Minikube drivers. These drivers, based on the operating system you are using with, the drivers you need to be enabling. Either you have to enable your Docker driver or hypervisor, you can use with the Hyper-V driver installation. So the same thing is explained here in this command, you need to provide with the driver Hyper-V. So once you enable this, your Minikube cluster can be started here. So Minikube cluster is enabled. Now you can see how do we check whether Minikube is started or not. You can also check with the Minikube status. So this is a status like what is the host and what kubelet is it running or not, okay, whether API server is running or not, configuration is done or not, okay. So this is all the configuration you can check with. The next step is if you wanted to check your status of your Minikube, just you can open your Minikube dashboard. I'm sorry, that's a spell mistake. So whenever you go for Minikube dashboard, you are able to enable your Kubernetes Minikube cluster UI interface, where you can observe there is no pods created, there is no replica sets, nothing is created, just it is an empty cluster. This is how the cluster installation can be done. Hope everybody clear with the Kubernetes Minikube single node cluster installation on a local machine. And next is we need to also configure kubelet service into our system to communicate, to perform with any operations with our cluster. So that is a kubectl command line interface. So this is also you need to download. So it is an installer once again. So you just go here and you can check your kubectl installer. So if you have already have curl tool in your system, like you just go here and here you will have steps to install your kubectl. So this is the steps you can follow with, so that your kubectl is downloaded and you can just set the path for this kubectl as well. Once it is done, so on the same PowerShell window you can just open with the new window, where you can start working with your kubectl commands. So this is the set of installation is needed to start with Kubernetes. So kubectl, you can just first check with the kubectl command. So here so far we have not created any pod in our cluster and nothing is created, just it is an empty cluster we just installed, right? So you can say now kubectl get, we further going to discuss with all the remaining commands, just I am checking with the one simple command whether any pods are created. So kubectl pods, there is no resources found in your namespace, means we haven't created any pod. So this is all about setting up the environment for Kubernetes hands-on. That's all. Kubernetes pod creation and deployment we will see in the next session.